Flames leap across a hilltop as villagers drive their cattle through fire. Midnight gatherings, strange rituals, and offerings no one fully explains. What was really happening on these nights? Why did people risk everything around roaring bonfires? What secrets were hidden in smoke and ash? And how could traditions this old still survive year after year, century after century? Beltane is one of those rare traditions that reaches back so far into human history that its roots disappear into the mists of pre-Christian Europe. The word itself comes from Old Irish, Beltane, which translates roughly as bright fire. And that name tells you almost everything you need to know. Fire, light, the blazing sun returning to power after months of cold darkness. This wasn't just any celebration. Beltane marked the official beginning of summer in the Celtic calendar, celebrated on the night of April 30th into May 1st. For the Celts living in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and across the British Isles, summer meant the growing season. It meant survival. It meant the half of the year when the land could actually provide food, when animals could graze on green pastures, when crops could push up through warming soil. The Celtic year was beautifully simple, divided into 4 major festivals. Samhain arrived on November 1st, ushering in the dark half of the year. Imbolc came on February 1st, signalling the first stirrings of spring. Beltane claimed May 1st, announcing summer's arrival. And Lugnasad on August 1st celebrated the first harvest. These 4 festivals were like pillars holding up the entire yearly cycle. Beltane held special significance because it represented one of the 2 great hinges of the year. While Samhain opened the door to winter and darkness, Beltane flung wide the gates to summer and light. The Celts understood their world in terms of these 2 great halves. The dark half, when the earth slept, and the light half, when the world exploded into green abundance. So where does this tradition really start? The earliest written records appear in medieval Irish texts. The Dinsenchas, which means the law of places, and the Sanas Cormac, or Cormac's glossary, both mention Beltane and its rituals. These texts come from the 9th through 12th centuries, written by Christian monks documenting practices that had survived despite centuries of Christian influence. That tells us something powerful. Beltane wasn't just a ceremony people could set aside. It was fundamental to how communities understood the natural world. The core purpose of Beltane centered on 3 interconnected ideas: protection, purification, and fertility. Protection came first. Winter wasn't just cold and dark. It was alive with dangerous forces, malevolent spirits, and harmful energies that could threaten livestock, crops, and people. When your survival depended entirely on the health of your cattle and the success of your plantings, anything that could harm them was genuine terror. Beltane rituals were designed to drive away these winter forces. Purification worked hand in hand with protection. After months of living in close quarters with smoke and animals and limited washing, both people and livestock needed renewal. The Beltane fires provided that. Walking through the smoke, driving cattle between bonfires, spreading ashes on fields. These weren't just symbolic. People genuinely believed fire had the power to burn away sickness and leave everyone fresh with the season ahead. And then fertility. Beltane celebrated the earth's fertility, the explosion of growth happening everywhere. But it also celebrated human fertility, animal fertility, and the mysterious life force pouring back into the world. Everything was breeding, growing, multiplying. Consider how all three purposes work together. You couldn't have fertility without first driving away harmful forces. You couldn't ensure protection without purifying fire, and you couldn't purify without invoking fertility to refill what the purification cleared away. Each element depended on the others, creating a complete system of renewal. The sun played the central role. Beltane's fires represented and honored the sun itself, that great source of warmth and light returning to full power. When communities lit their bonfires, they were bringing the sun's power down to earth, harnessing it for protection and blessing. The timing of Beltane hit a sweet spot in the agricultural calendar. The danger of hard frost was mostly past. Grass was growing thick enough for grazing. Seeds could safely go into the ground. But the season was still young enough that rituals could cover the whole growing period ahead. It was a moment of hope and anxiety mixed together. Now we've explored where Beltane came from and why it mattered. But to really grasp Beltane, we need to meet the divine powers who presided over it. Who were the people really calling out to when they lit those massive bonfires on May Eve? Understanding the divine figures behind Beltane opens up the spiritual world of our Celtic ancestors. At the heart of Beltane stood Belenus, sometimes called Belimor, the Celtic god of light, healing, and the sun's power. His name appears across ancient Europe, from Gaul through northern Italy, and across the British Isles. Belenus wasn't some minor local spirit. He was a major deity whose influence reached across the entire Celtic world. The connection between Belenus and Beltane isn't just linguistic. Belenus embodied everything the festival celebrated. He was the sun's warmth returning to strength. He was the healing power that would keep people and animals healthy. He was the light that drove away darkness and all the dangerous things darkness might hide. Picture Belenus as radiant, powerful, beneficent, not a harsh or angry god, but one whose very nature was to give, to heal, to illuminate. The sun shines on everyone equally. Belenus shared that quality. His blessings were sought through respect and proper ritual, not fear. The fire itself became Belenus's symbol and tool. Every flame kindled at Beltane carried his essence. When cattle walked between bonfires, they passed through his purifying embrace. When people spread ashes on fields, they were spreading the god's blessing. The fire was both a gift to the god and a gift from the god. But Beltane's divine world wasn't exclusively male. Alongside Belenus stood Aine, a goddess whose name means brightness. Aine ruled over fertility, love, and the sun's vital life-giving energy. In Irish tradition, she was intimately connected with summer's arrival and all the creative forces summer unleashed. Aine's sacred sites still dot the Irish landscape, particularly Knockany in County Limerick. People visited these sites at Beltane, making offerings, seeking blessings. She represented the earth's fertility responding to the sun's warmth, the feminine principle transforming the masculine principle's energy into actual growth. Here's where the symbolism gets beautifully interconnected. Belenus and Aine, sun and earth, male and female, fire and soil, weren't opposed forces. They were complementary, necessary to each other. The Beltane celebration honored their sacred union, the coming together that made all life possible. When the sun's heat penetrated the soil, that was the divine marriage playing out in the physical world. Now, the Celts didn't separate their spiritual world from their physical world. Sacred was everywhere, woven through the landscape. Stones, wells, and springs held particular power. These places served as meeting points between the human realm and the other world. Wells and springs made perfect sense as sacred sites during a festival of renewal. Water emerging from the earth seemed like a miracle, a gift continuously flowing from hidden sources. These were portals where the earth's inner mysteries became visible. Decorating wells with flowers at Beltane honored the spirits associated with these sites. Standing stones also drew Beltane celebrants. Some had been erected thousands of years before Celtic culture even existed, ancient monuments whose original purpose was forgotten, but whose power remained. People left offerings at these stones, milk and butter, grain and flowers. The offerings themselves reveal Celtic spirituality. These weren't grand sacrifices. Beltane offerings were humble, products of daily life, given with understanding that sacred powers wanted to be acknowledged and respected, not impressed. The offerings reflected a reciprocal relationship. The gods gave blessings. Humans gave back a portion of what they received. 3 patterns emerge. First, the deities were fundamentally life-giving and beneficial. This wasn't about appeasing angry gods. It was celebrating the return of welcome powers. Second, divine powers were intimately connected to observable natural phenomena. Beltane was the sun you felt on your skin. Aina was present in greening fields and bursting flowers. Third, humans could actively engage with these powers through ritual. By lighting fires, making offerings, visiting sacred sites, communities could participate in the seasonal shift and share in divine blessings. This gave people agency. The sacred landscape itself participated in Beltane. Hills became natural altars. Waters revealed the earth's inner vitality. Ancient stones stood as witnesses to countless Beltanes. The land was alive with presence and power. We've now met the divine powers behind Beltane. Next, we need to see how spiritual understanding translated into actual practice, into the fire rituals that gave Beltane its name. How did people actually protect their most valuable possessions at this dangerous turning point between seasons? The answer lay in fire, carefully kindled and deliberately used to transform a natural element into spiritual power. The Beltane fire wasn't just any fire. It was the need fire, Taine Eigen in Old Irish, and the method of creating it mattered enormously. This fire had to be made by friction, by rubbing wood against wood until flames appeared. No flint, no borrowed coals. The need fire had to be new, pure, created specifically for this purpose through human effort. Why? Because the need fire represented a fresh start, untainted by anything before. Every hearth fire in the community would be extinguished first. All the fires that had burned through winter were snuffed out. The community stood in darkness, deliberately vulnerable. Then the need fire would be kindled on the hilltop, and from that single flame every hearth would be relit. It was a reset for the entire community. Creating the need fire often fell to druids in earlier periods, or respected elders later. They would use a wooden drill or wheel mechanism, spinning one piece of wood against another until friction generated enough heat to ignite tinder. It could take considerable effort, but that struggle was part of the ritual's power. When fire finally blazed up, it felt like victory. Once the need fire burned strong, livestock became the focus. Cattle were primary wealth for most Celtic communities, more valuable than gold. A healthy herd meant milk, butter, cheese, leather, meat. A sick herd meant poverty and potential starvation. Protecting cattle was literally life and death. The fire ritual was both simple and profound. 2 large bonfires would be built close together, creating a corridor of flame and smoke. Herders would drive their cattle through this fiery gateway, urging them forward despite their fear. As each animal passed through, smoke enveloped it, and Belenus's protective power was invoked. What were people really doing? Practically, smoke likely drove off insects and parasites, but the ritual's purpose went deeper. The passage through fire was spiritual cleansing and protection, removing harmful influences from winter and shielding animals from disease through the grazing season. The same principle applied to people. Beltane celebrants would walk through the smoke or leap through lower flames. This was personal purification, burning away accumulated weariness and potential illness of winter and emerging renewed. Think about the experience. You've lived through months of cold and difficult conditions. You approach the fire, feel its heat, smell sharp wood smoke. You gather courage and walk through, feeling smoke sting your eyes. You emerge heart-pounding, feeling cleansed and invigorated. Your body and mind both register that something significant happened. After the main rituals, fire's power continued working through the community. Ashes from the bonfire were carefully collected and treated as holy material. People spread them on fields, blessing soil for the growing season. They rubbed ashes on animals, children, themselves, like spiritual ointment offering protection. Hearth fires received special attention. Representatives from each household would carry burning brands from the communal fire back home. They would use this flame to relight their hearths, bringing Belenus's blessing directly into their dwellings. For the rest of the year, that hearth fire would be tended and kept alive. This practice created a web of connections. Every home's fire came from the same source. Every hearth shared the same blessing. If you visited your neighbor, you were warmed by a spiritually identical fire. This bound the community together through shared ritual. 3 key ideas underlie these fire practices. First, fire could purify by burning away harmful influences. People genuinely believe smoke and flame destroy dangerous forces. Fire transforms, fire cleanses, fire destroys the old to make room for new. Second, fire could be protected through its association with the sun and Belenus. The fire on earth and the sun in heaven were the same divine power at different scales. Bringing fire into contact with animals, fields, and people brought the sun god's protective presence to everything needing protection. Third, fire created continuity and connection. The single need fire became dozens of hearth fires, all linked back to the original. That original connected back to previous years, forming an unbroken chain reaching into the mythic past. The timing mattered, typically performed at dawn or dusk, those liminal moments when day and night met. Dawn in May first meant performing rituals as the sun itself was rising. Location mattered too. Beltane fires were lit on high ground, on hills where flames would be visible across the countryside. Having walked through the fire ourselves, we're ready to explore another dimension of Beltane focused on creation rather than protection. What does it mean to truly celebrate life's creative power? Beltane answered with an openness that might surprise modern sensibilities. Fertility wasn't separate from the rest of life for the Celts. It was the essence of summer itself, the defining quality that made the light half different from the dark half. Winter was containment, conservation. Summer was an explosion, abundance, life multiplying itself with wild generosity. Beltane marked that transition. Fertility operated on multiple levels. It was about crops growing and animals breeding, but it was also fundamentally about human fertility, human sexuality, human vitality. The Celts didn't sharply separate these categories. The same life force that made seeds sprout also made people fall in love. It was all one great river of creative energy. One characteristic Beltane custom was a Maying. Young people spending May Eve night outdoors in the woods. As darkness fell on April 30th, groups of young men and women would leave their villages and head into the countryside. They would stay out all night, gathering flowers and branches by moonlight, singing, dancing, celebrating away from watchful eyes. What happened during these adventures? The honest answer is that considerable romantic and sexual activity occurred. Beltane was a time when normal social rules relaxed, when young people had permission to explore attraction and desire with unusual freedom. The darkness, excitement, and sense of participating in something ancient created an atmosphere where inhibitions fell away. This wasn't considered scandalous, at least not in the pre-Christian period. Sexual union during Beltane was understood as participating in the season's great fertility, aligning human reproduction with nature's reproduction. If the gods came together in sacred union at this time, then humans doing the same honored divine patterns. The flowers and greenery collected during a Maying served multiple purposes. They were beautiful and added to the festival atmosphere, but they also symbolized new life, tangible proof that winter's barrenness was overcome. Particular flowers like primroses and marigolds were associated with the sun's return and Belenus's blessing. Green branches, especially hawthorn and rowan, carried protective and blessing properties. Hanging them over doorways warded off harmful influences. The fresh green leaves represented life in its newest, most vigorous form. The custom of hand fastings added another layer to fertility celebration. A hand fasting was a form of trial marriage lasting a year and a day. Couples would publicly declare their hand fasting during Beltane, exchanging vows before their community. They would live together as husband and wife. At the end of that period, they could formalize their union in permanent marriage or part ways with no shame. This reflects sophisticated understanding of human relationships. Young people could test compatibility before permanent commitment. If pregnancy resulted, the couple was already in a recognized relationship. If the relationship didn't work, both were free to try again. The community accepted this as normal courtship. The belief that children conceived during Beltane would be especially strong and blessed gave the festival's sexual dimension additional significance. Parents hoped for Beltane babies, understanding that a child created during this peak moment would carry some of that power throughout life. 3 patterns emerge. First, sexuality was integrated into the sacred rather than opposed to it. The same rituals that honored gods also celebrated human sexual desire. Spiritual purity didn't require sexual abstinence. Second, fertility was celebrated communally rather than just privately. The whole community knew young people were heading into the woods and approved. Hand fastings were public declarations. Even private sexual activity had a communal dimension. Third, human fertility was seen as interconnected with all other fertility. The same rituals that blessed fields also blessed human unions. Everything was connected, all part of the same great pattern of renewal. The songs, dances, and feasts that accompanied Beltane added another dimension. Music and dancing raised energy, creating states of excitement and joy. The rhythmic movement, the emotional power, these weren't just entertainment. They were technologies for shifting consciousness. Feasting reinforced community bonds while providing practical nourishment. The feast brought everyone together around shared food, emphasizing they were one community celebrating as one body. Beltane represented renewal of human and natural life after winter dormancy. The custom gave people permission to fully embrace their physical nature, to celebrate desire and pleasure as gifts rather than shameful impulses. In doing so, they aligned themselves with the season's overwhelming message. Life wants to create more life, and that impulse is holy. Now that we've explored human fertility celebration, we're ready to look at the natural symbols that made Beltane's meaning visible and tangible. How do you make invisible spiritual forces visible? The Celts answered through sacred plants and symbols that transformed abstract concepts into things you could touch, smell, and see. Hawthorn stood at the center of Beltane symbolism. Called the May tree because it blooms precisely at the beginning of May, hawthorn was one of the most sacred plants in Celtic tradition. Its white or pink blossoms appeared right at the festival's peak. Those flowers represented fertility and good fortune. People would cut hawthorn branches on May Eve and bring them home to hang over doors, windows, and barns. These weren't just decorations. They were protective charms, believed to keep harmful spirits and bad luck from entering. The hawthorn's thorns added to its protective power, creating a natural barrier. But the blossoms softened that protection with blessing and beauty. The tree was considered so sacred that cutting it at the wrong time could bring terrible misfortune. But at Beltane, taking branches was not only acceptable, but encouraged. The timing mattered. The tree's power was at its peak during blooming. Rowan was another crucial plant for protection. This tree was believed especially effective against witchcraft and evil spirits. People made small crosses from rowan twigs, binding them with red thread, and placed these charms over doorways or carried them for personal protection. The combination of sacred wood and red thread, representing fire and life force, created a powerful ward. Flowers played their own crucial role. Primroses were associated with the first light of spring and the sun's growing power. Yellow gorse, blazing bright on hillsides, echoed the sun's color. Marigolds brought solar blessings wherever placed. These flowers weren't chosen randomly. Each bloomed at or near Beltane, making them natural symbols of the season. Each carried colors and qualities that resonated with the festival's themes of light, warmth, and new life. Gathering them connected people directly with the landscape's transformation. People would weave flowers into garlands and crowns, wear them in their hair, scatter them where dances took place. Homes would be filled with fresh flowers, their scent replacing the closed-in smell of winter. The whole community became a garden for a day. The maypole deserves special attention because it became one of the most recognizable symbols of May Day. A maypole was a tall, wooden pole, often a whole tree trunk, erected in a central location for dancing. Long ribbons would be attached to the top, and dancers would hold these ribbons as they moved in patterns around the pole, weaving the ribbons into complex designs. What did the maypole represent? On the most obvious level, it was a phallic symbol representing masculine creative energy. But it was more complex. The pole also represented the world axis, the cosmic pillar connecting earth and sky, human and divine. Dancing around it traced sacred patterns, binding the community together while connecting them to larger cosmic forces. The weaving of ribbons created something beautiful from separate strands, just as the community created social harmony from individual people. The up and down, in and out movement echoed the interweaving of male and female, of complementary opposites coming together. The green man motif appeared throughout Beltane, a face made of or surrounded by leaves and vegetation, representing nature spirit and the vital force of growing things. You might see green man imagery in masks worn by celebrants or in decorations. The green man embodied the idea that nature was alive, conscious in its own way, full of spirit and power. Wells and springs receive special decoration at Beltane, adorned with flowers, ribbons, and garlands. This practice, called well dressing, transformed these water sources into visible shrines. The decorations honored the spirits of the wells, thanking them for water and asking for continued blessing. Water was life, but holy wells represented something more. They were places where the hidden depths of the earth revealed themselves. People would visit decorated wells to drink the water, believing it carried special healing properties at Beltane. They might circle the well a certain number of times or leave offerings. 3 principles unified all these plant symbols. First, they made spiritual concepts tangible. You couldn't see fertility as an abstract idea, but you could see hawthorn blossoms and rowan crosses. The symbols gave people something concrete to work with. Second, the symbols connected human activity with natural cycles. Using plants that bloomed precisely at Beltane grounded the celebration in observable reality. The festival responded to what was actually happening in the landscape. Third, the symbols created beauty, and that beauty mattered. Beltane was joyous, celebratory, overflowing with colour and life. The flowers, the greenery, the decorated poles and wells all contributed to an atmosphere of abundance and delight. The beauty itself was part of the blessing. A home prepared for Beltane would have hawthorn over the door, rowan crosses on windows, flowers on every surface, fresh branches hanging from the ceiling. Walking into such a space, you'd immediately feel something special happening. Your senses would be engaged. Your mood would lift. The transformation of space helped transform consciousness. We've now seen how plants and symbols made Beltane's meaning visible. But this exuberant pagan celebration couldn't continue unchanged once a new religion arrived with very different ideas about what was sacred. What happens when a new faith meets old traditions? The story of how Christianity encountered Beltane reveals the complex ways religious change actually unfolds. Christian authorities, from the earliest days of the Church's arrival in Celtic lands, condemned Beltane as pagan fire worship. Here was a festival centered on fires lit to honor pre-Christian gods, featuring open sexuality and maintaining practices predating Christianity by centuries. From the Church's perspective, these were heathen customs leading people away from true faith. Early medieval church texts specifically warned against lighting what they called heathen fires. They forbade Christians from participating in May Eve celebrations, from walking through Beltane fires, from making offerings to stones or wells. Some texts prescribe penances for those who engaged in these practices, treating participation as serious sin. The Church particularly objected to three aspects. First, worship of pagan deities like Belenus and Aine. Second, the sexual freedom of May Eve, which contradicted Christian teachings about chastity. Third, the belief that fires, ashes, and plant symbols had spiritual power independent of Christian prayer and sacraments. All three struck at core Christian doctrines. But here's what's fascinating. Despite centuries of condemnation, rural communities continued Beltane rites. They did so sometimes covertly, hiding practices from church authorities. They did so sometimes openly, in areas where the church's reach was limited. They did so because these traditions were woven too deeply into life to simply abandon on command. Think about what this means. You're a farmer whose family has driven cattle through Beltane fires for generations. Everyone you know does the same. The ritual gives you confidence your herd will stay healthy. A priest arrives and says this practice offends God. What do? Many would find ways to continue, perhaps justifying it to themselves as merely practical, not truly religious. The church couldn't simply erase Beltane, so it began a process of adaptation and reinterpretation. Elements of the festival were gradually absorbed into Christian observance, stripped of their most obviously pagan associations, and given new meanings. The fires remained, but were now associated with Christian occasions like St. John's Eve or Walpurgis Night, rather than Belenus. Walpurgis Night, celebrated on April 30th, the same night as May Eve, became a Christian alternative to Beltane. Saint Walpurga, an 8th century English missionary, had her feast day placed on May 1st. The night before, I became associated with her. Fires lit on Walpurgis Night could be understood as honoring a Christian saint, rather than pagan gods. The practice looked very similar, but the theological justification changed. May Day itself emerged as a Christianized version of Beltane. The festival retained customs of dancing, greenery, and bonfires, but these were detached from explicit pagan worship. May Day celebrated spring and community, not gods and goddesses. The church could tolerate it mostly, as long as the sexual freedom of a Maying was curtailed, and no one was making offerings to Aine. Clerical suppression was strongest from the 8th to 12th centuries, but it was never fully successful. The gap between official church teaching and actual rural practice remained wide. Priests in small villages often had to accommodate local customs to maintain their congregations. A hard line against Beltane might leave a priest with an empty church. This process of religious change, where old and new blend together rather than one simply replacing the other, is called syncretism. Celtic Beltane practices didn't disappear under Christianity. They transformed, adapted, continued under new names with adjusted meanings. The underlying structure, the celebration of spring's return, and the blessing of fields and herds persisted even as the theological framework shifted. Three patterns emerged from this religious encounter. First, popular customs proved remarkably resistant to official condemnation. People valued traditions that connected them to their ancestors and the land. They weren't going to abandon these easily. Second, the church eventually learned to adapt, rather than simply prohibit, by providing Christian alternatives and reinterpreting pagan symbols. The church could guide popular religion rather than fight it directly. Third, The result was neither pure paganism nor pure Christianity, but a hybrid tradition where elements from both mixed together. The May fires continued, but their meaning became ambiguous, perhaps honouring saints, perhaps maintaining older patterns. By the late medieval period, Beltane as an explicitly pagan festival had largely disappeared from public view, but its customs, its timing, its essential spirit survived in May Day celebrations across Europe. The transformation from Beltane to May Day shows how deeply rooted these seasonal traditions were, and how difficult it proved to completely erase them. We've seen how Christianity confronted and gradually absorbed Beltane. Next, we'll explore how those transformed traditions manifested in the May Day customs that became familiar across Europe. How did a pagan fire festival become the cheerful spring celebration familiar across Europe? The journey from Beltane to May Day shows both what survived and what changed when old customs adapted to new contexts. May Day emerged in medieval Europe as a continuation of Beltane seasonal celebrations, but with significant modifications. The date remained the same, May 1st. The emphasis on welcoming summer remained, but the explicitly pagan religious elements were either removed or disguised under Christian or secular interpretations. The customs that survived were those that could be understood as simply celebrating spring rather than worshipping specific gods. Dancing, gathering greenery, lighting bonfires, these activities didn't inherently require belief in Belinus or Aine. They could be reframed as community celebration and seasonal festivity. The Church could tolerate, if not always enthusiastically endorse, such customs. The maypole became one of the most characteristic features of May Day celebrations. Villages would erect tall poles in central locations, decorate them with flowers and ribbons, and gather for elaborate dances. Young people especially participated, weaving complex patterns with the ribbons as they circled the pole. The maypole retained its symbolic associations with fertility and cosmic connection, but these meanings became less explicit, more intuitive than openly discussed. Maypole dances served practical social functions. They brought the community together in coordinated activity, strengthening social bonds. They provided entertainment and spectacle. They gave young people a socially approved context for interaction and courtship. The dance was complex enough to require practice and cooperation, teaching valuable social skills while also being simply fun. May Queens emerged as another enduring tradition. A young woman from the community would be chosen and crowned as Queen of the May, dressed in white with flowers in her hair, representing spring, fertility, and beauty. She would preside over the day's festivities, lead processions, and receive the community's honor. The May Queen clearly echoed earlier goddess worship, particularly of figures like Aine. But in the Christian context, she could be understood as merely symbolic, a pretty custom honoring spring rather than an actual religious figure. The ambiguity worked. Communities could maintain traditions that felt ancient and meaningful without explicitly challenging church teaching. The custom of bringing in the May derived directly from Beltane's practice of gathering flowers and greenery on May Eve. On May Day morning, people would go into the countryside to collect branches, flowers, and foliage. They would bring these back to decorate their homes, the maypole, and public spaces. The activity retained the sense of connecting with nature's renewal while losing explicit ritual significance. community feasts and fairs became central to May Day celebrations. Villages would prepare special foods, set up games and competitions, create markets where goods could be bought and sold. The day became a major social event, anticipated throughout the year. People would travel from neighboring areas to attend larger celebrations, making May Day a time for reunions and socializing beyond one's immediate community. The focus shifted from sacred protection to festive and agricultural celebration. While Beltane had centered on invoking divine blessing and driving away harmful forces, May Day emphasized communal joy and the practical realities of the growing season. Farmers still cared deeply about their crops and herds, but the methods of ensuring their success became less explicitly magical, more practical. That said, many protective and blessing customs continued in folk practice, even as their theological justification changed. People still gathered flowers to hang over doors, still believed in the protective power of certain plants, still made small rituals to encourage fertility and prosperity. These practices went underground, became private rather than communal, or were performed with less fanfare than before. 3 key differences distinguish May Day from Beltane. First, the religious dimension became muted or eliminated. May Day could be celebrated without reference to any gods, pagan or Christian. It was a seasonal festival that stood on its own. Second, the sexual openness of Beltane was significantly curtailed. While courtship and romance remained part of May Day, the explicit celebration of sexuality disappeared from public practice. The overnight adventures of a Maying were discouraged or banned. Handfastings, if they continued at all, became private arrangements rather than public celebrations. Third, the communal fires, while they sometimes continued, lost their central ritual importance. Some areas maintained May bonfires, but these became optional extras rather than the essential core of the celebration. The fire that gave Beltane its name became secondary in May Day traditions. Yet, despite these changes, the essential spirit of the celebration persisted. May Day remained a time to acknowledge the turning of seasons, to celebrate life's renewal, to strengthen community bonds, and to look forward with hope to summer's abundance. The customs looked different, the meanings had shifted, but the underlying pattern endured. Regional variations in May Day celebrations developed across Europe. Each area adapted the basic template to local conditions and preferences. Some places emphasized the maypole, others focused on May Queens. Some maintained bonfires, others developed unique games or foods. This diversity shows how flexible the tradition became, able to accommodate many different expressions while maintaining recognizable continuity. The transformation from Beltane to May Day demonstrates how traditions evolve rather than simply disappear. When religious or cultural change occurs, people don't abandon everything from before. They adapt, reinterpret, and preserve what matters to them in forms that fit new contexts. May Day carried Beltane's essence into a Christian world, ensuring that the celebration of spring's return would continue for centuries more. Having seen how Beltane transformed into May Day, we're ready to explore how these traditions survived in folk customs, even as official religious observance faded. Where did Beltane really go after Christianity discouraged its open celebration? The answer lies in folk customs that persisted quietly in rural communities, carrying ancient traditions forward in modified forms. Beltane fires were still being recorded in the Scottish Highlands until the late 19th century. This is remarkable. More than 1,000 years after Christianity arrived in Scotland, communities in remote areas still gathered on May Eve to light ceremonial bonfires. The practice had survived through generations, passed down through oral tradition and seasonal repetition. 18th century reports document need fire rituals specifically for cattle health. When disease struck a herd, communities would gather to create the traditional friction fire, then drive their animals through the smoke just as their ancestors had done at Beltane. The ritual was performed not as a regular seasonal celebration, but as emergency response to crisis. Still, the knowledge of how to create and use the need fire persisted. In Ireland, May Eve continued to be treated with special reverence well into the modern era. People made offerings of milk or butter to fairies and spirits, leaving these gifts outside their homes or at special locations like fairy trees or ancient mounds. The theological framework had shifted. Instead of offering to Aine or other named goddesses, people spoke of appeasing the good folk or the fairies. But the practice itself continued virtually unchanged. The fairy belief system that flourished in Ireland and Scotland served as a way to maintain pre-Christian traditions under a different name. Fairies occupied an ambiguous position in Christian culture. They weren't quite pagan gods, weren't quite Christian demons, but existed in a grey area that allowed old customs to continue. What had once been offerings to deities could now be explained as prudent precautions against fairy mischief. Protective charms hung on doors during May Eve persisted as common practice. Rowan crosses, iron objects, specific arrangements of plants, these wards against harmful forces remained part of rural life. People might not have articulated why they hung these protections, or might have given vague explanations about bad luck or evil influences, but the customs themselves continued unbroken from pagan times. Children and animals were marked with ashes from May fires for safety, a practice that survived even when the larger communal celebrations faded. A family might light their own small fire rather than gathering with the whole community, then use the ashes in the traditional way. The scale had diminished, but the essential belief in fire's protective power remained. The last known large-scale Beltane fire festival in Scotland was reportedly held in 1897. By that point, these celebrations had become curiosities, old-fashioned customs that observers documented as disappearing traditions. But even that late date shows extraordinary persistence. Beltane had survived in recognizable form for well over a millennium after Christianity became dominant. Folk practices preserved through oral tradition and seasonal repetition proved remarkably durable. Written texts could be lost or destroyed. Official religious teachings could change, but knowledge passed from parent to child, from neighbor to neighbor, embedded in the rhythm of the agricultural year, proved difficult to eliminate. People might forget why they did something, but they remembered that it should be done. 3 factors explain the survival of Beltane customs in folk practice. First, rural isolation protected traditions from outside interference. In remote highland valleys or isolated Irish farms, church authorities had limited reach. Local communities could maintain their customs largely undisturbed, especially if these practices occurred at night or in private, rather than as public spectacles. Second, the customs served practical purposes that remained relevant regardless of religious changes. Farmers still needed healthy livestock. Families still wanted protection from disease and misfortune. The old rituals offered ways to address these needs that felt effective based on generations of experience. Why abandon practices that seemed to work? Third, the customs connected people to their ancestors and their land in emotionally meaningful ways. Performing the same rituals your grandparents and great-grandparents had performed created continuity across time. It maintained identity and belonging in communities where little else changed for centuries. These weren't just superstitions. They were traditions that bound families and communities together. The protective emphasis of folk customs shows what people valued most. While the explicitly religious and sexual dimensions of Beltane faded or went underground, the protective rituals remained. Driving cattle through smoke, hanging charms on doors, marking children with ashes, these practices addressed fundamental anxieties about health, safety, and survival that transcended any particular religious framework. May Eve in particular retained an aura of danger and possibility in folk belief. This was a night when the boundary between worlds thinned, when supernatural forces were active, when special caution was needed. People would avoid certain activities, stay inside after dark, or perform specific protective rituals. The night required attention and respect, carrying forward Beltane's sense of liminality and power. Some customs transformed in ways that disguised their origins while preserving their essence. The May Bush tradition in Ireland, for instance, involved decorating a bush or small tree with flowers, ribbons, and candles on May Eve, then displaying it outside the home. This was clearly related to the older practice of gathering sacred branches, but had become a cheerful decoration rather than an explicitly magical charm. Regional variations in folk customs developed over time, each area creating its own distinctive version of May traditions. What survived in one valley might differ from what survived over the next hill. This diversity actually helped preserve the broader tradition, as different communities maintained different pieces of the original whole. The knowledge of medicinal and magical plants associated with Beltane persisted strongly in folk tradition. People continued to gather specific herbs and flowers on May Day, believing these had special potency when collected at this time. Herbalists and traditional healers maintained detailed knowledge of what to gather when, preserving botanical wisdom that reached back to pre-Christian times. Children's games and rhymes sometimes preserved fragments of older traditions in forms that seemed innocuous. Certain ring dances, counting rhymes, or games played on May Day contained echoes of ancient ritual patterns, though the children playing them had no idea of their origins. Cultural memory worked in mysterious ways, maintaining patterns across generations even when explicit meaning was lost. By the early 20th century, folklorists and anthropologists began documenting these surviving customs with urgency, recognizing that modernization and urbanization were finally accomplishing what centuries of church opposition hadn't: the disappearance of traditional folk practices. Their records preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been completely lost. The survival of Beltane customs in folk practice demonstrates the resilience of traditions deeply embedded in agricultural life and community identity. These weren't merely quaint old customs. They were living practices that continued to serve meaningful functions for the people who maintained them. Only when rural life itself fundamentally changed did these traditions finally begin to fade from regular practice. Having explored how Beltane survived in folk customs into the modern era, we're now ready to see how the 20th century brought an unexpected revival of the ancient festival in new forms. What happens when an ancient festival that nearly disappeared gets rediscovered and reimagined? The 20th century Celtic revival movements brought Beltane back to life in ways both familiar and entirely new. The Celtic revival began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as scholars, artists, and cultural enthusiasts developed renewed interest in pre-Christian Celtic culture. After centuries of suppression and neglect, Celtic languages, mythology, and traditions suddenly became subjects of serious study and romantic celebration. People wanted to reconnect with their ancestral heritage, to reclaim what had been lost or hidden. Beltane naturally attracted attention as one of the most dramatic and well-documented Celtic festivals. The image of hilltop bonfires, the symbolism of fertility and renewal, the connection to nature's cycles, all of these appealed to people seeking alternatives to modern industrial life and conventional Christianity. Beltane offered a vision of spirituality rooted in nature, community, and seasonal awareness. The modern Wiccan movement, which emerged in the mid-20th century, incorporated Beltane into its Wheel of the Year as one of 8 Sabbats or holy days. Gerald Gardner and other founders of Wicca drew on historical research, folklore, and their own creativity to construct a nature-based religious system that honored pre-Christian European traditions, or at least their interpretation of those traditions. In Wiccan practice, Beltane celebrates the sacred marriage of the god and goddess, the union of masculine and feminine divine forces that brings fertility to the world. This interpretation draws on the historical pairing of deities like Belinus and Ine, but frames it within Wicca's own theological understanding. The emphasis on divine polarity and sacred sexuality echoes authentic pagan themes while expressing them in contemporary forms. Neo-pagans observe Beltane with bonfires, circle dances, and symbolic rituals representing fertility and union. Modern celebrations often include the Great Rite, a ritual that symbolically or actually represents sexual union between divine masculine and feminine principles. This can be performed symbolically by lowering an athame or ritual knife into a chalice, or privately between consenting partners as an act of worship. The modern Edinburgh Beltane Fire Festival, established in 1988, attracts thousands of participants and spectators annually. This massive public celebration features elaborate costumes, fire performances, processions through the city streets, and dramatic presentations on Calton Hill. It's theatrical, spectacular, and consciously artistic, rather than attempting to authentically recreate ancient practices. The Edinburgh Festival demonstrates how modern Beltane has become as much about performance and community celebration as about religious observance. Participants include people of many faiths and no faith, united by appreciation for spectacle, creativity, and seasonal celebration. The festival has become a cultural event that transcends any particular religious framework. Contemporary Beltane emphasizes environmental harmony, creativity, and seasonal awareness, rather than literal belief in specific deities. Modern celebrants might honor Belinus and Aine as symbolic figures representing natural forces, rather than as actual supernatural beings. The focus is on connecting with nature's cycles, celebrating life's creative power, and building community. Fire ceremonies remain central to modern Beltane, but are revived as symbolic acts of renewal, rather than literal protection against disease or evil spirits. Participants might write down what they wish to release from their lives and burn the paper in the fire, or state intentions for growth and creativity in the coming season. The fire serves as a focal point for transformation and commitment, rather than a tool for driving away malevolent forces. Three key differences distinguish modern Beltane from its historical predecessor. First, participation is voluntary and conscious, rather than expected or required. No one celebrates modern Beltane because their survival depends on it. People participate because they find it meaningful, beautiful, or fun. The festival has become a choice rather than a necessity. Second, modern Beltane is eclectic and creative rather than rigidly traditional. Contemporary celebrants freely adapt, modify, and invent, drawing inspiration from historical sources, but not feeling bound by them. The emphasis is on personal meaning and emotional resonance, rather than historical accuracy or orthodox practice. Third, modern Beltane exists within a pluralistic context, rather than representing the dominant religious worldview of a community. Ancient Celts celebrated Beltane because everyone around them did. Modern pagans celebrate Beltane as a minority practice, often explaining or justifying their observance to a broader culture that may find it strange or interesting. Yet, despite these differences, modern Beltane maintains genuine continuity with ancient tradition. The date remains the same. The core symbols of fire, flowers, and greenery persist. The themes of fertility, renewal, and connection with nature remain central. The sense of participating in something ancient, of touching traditions that reach back through countless generations, provides meaningful connection to ancestral wisdom. Modern interpretations blend ancient Celtic myth with performance and community celebration in ways that serve contemporary needs. People aren't trying to become ancient Celts. They're creating living traditions that honor the past while addressing present circumstances. This creative adaptation actually follows the pattern of how traditions have always evolved, changing to fit new contexts while maintaining essential continuity. The revival of Beltane in modern paganism represents a broader phenomenon of people seeking spirituality connected to nature, seasons, and bodily experience, rather than abstract theology. In a world increasingly disconnected from natural cycles and agricultural rhythms, consciously marking seasonal turning points offers grounding and meaning. Beltane provides a framework for celebrating spring, honoring fertility and growth, and participating in traditions larger than any individual life. Some critics argue that modern paganism invents traditions rather than reviving them, creating a romanticized fantasy of ancient spirituality that bears little resemblance to actual historical practice. There's some truth to this critique. Modern Beltane is undoubtedly different from ancient Beltane in many ways, but the impulse to celebrate seasonal change, to honor life's creative forces, to gather around fire with community, these are genuinely ancient and universal human practices. The modern revival of Beltane shows that traditions thought dead can be brought back to life in new forms, when people find them valuable and meaningful. The specific practices may change, but the underlying patterns persist. The human need to mark time, celebrate community, and connect with nature's cycles continues regardless of historical period or religious framework. Having explored how Beltane has been revived and reimagined in modern times, we're ready to consider the festival's broader legacy and what it reveals about human culture and spirituality. What does an ancient fire festival that has survived for millennia in various forms tell us about human nature and cultural continuity? Beltane's long history offers profound insights into how we relate to seasons, community, and the sacred. Beltane reflects the enduring human link between seasonal cycles and ritual expression. Across cultures and throughout history, people have marked important turning points in the year with ceremony and celebration. The spring equinox, summer solstice, harvest time, midwinter. These natural pivots demand acknowledgement. Beltane shows one particular culture's response to one particular moment, but it represents a universal impulse. Why do humans need to ritualize seasonal change? Because we are creatures who create meaning through action and symbol. Simply observing that spring has arrived isn't enough. We need to participate in that arrival, to actively welcome it, to feel ourselves as agents rather than passive observers. Ritual transforms us from spectators watching the world change to participants helping that change happen. Beltane's traditions influenced European May Day celebrations, Walpurgis night festivities, and even midsummer celebrations across the continent. You can trace threads of Beltane symbolism through centuries of cultural evolution, seeing how its elements dispersed, merged with other traditions, and re-emerged in new combinations. The maypole, the May Queen, the gathering of flowers, the bonfires, all carry echoes of ancient Beltane even when disconnected from their original context. The festival represents the survival of pre-Christian agricultural spirituality in modern Europe. While Christianity dramatically changed the religious landscape, it couldn't entirely erase older patterns of relating to land, seasons, and community. Those patterns proved too fundamental, too deeply embedded in how agricultural communities functioned. They adapted, disguised themselves, went underground when necessary, but persisted. Fire remains Beltane's central symbol of transformation, health, and renewal, even in modern celebrations. The primal power of flame speaks to something deep in human psychology. Fire warms. Fire illuminates darkness. Fire transforms what it touches, turning wood to ash, cooking food, purifying through heat. Using fire in ritual taps into associations that reach back before recorded history, to the earliest human ancestors who first learned to control and use this elemental force. Beltane demonstrates the adaptation of ancient customs into new social and religious contexts. The same essential festival has been pagan religious observance, folk custom, Christianized May Day celebration, secular spring festival, and modern neo-pagan spirituality. Each version looked different, carried different explicit meanings, served different social functions, yet all remained recognizably related, maintaining continuity through change. This adaptability suggests that the core of Beltane isn't its specific theological framework, but its response to universal human needs and experiences. The need to mark time's passage, the need to celebrate community, the need to acknowledge our dependence on natural cycles, the need to participate in rituals that connect us to something larger than individual existence. These needs persist regardless of religious beliefs or cultural context. Beltane serves as evidence of how Celtic cosmology valued harmony between nature, community, and divine forces. The festival wasn't about humanity dominating nature or appeasing angry gods. It was about alignment, participation, cooperation. Humans worked with divine powers and natural cycles rather than against them. The rituals aimed to harmonize human activity with larger patterns, ensuring that community life flowed with rather than against the world's fundamental rhythms. This worldview has much to offer modern culture, which often sees nature as either resource to exploit or wilderness to preserve separate from human activity. Beltane suggests a third option: nature as partner, as context for human flourishing, as alive and responsive rather than dead and mechanical. Whether or not one believes in literal gods and spirits, the underlying attitude of respect and relationship with the natural world remains valuable. Beltane continues to be studied as a key example of living folk tradition evolving over millennia. Folklorists, historians, anthropologists, and religious studies scholars all find rich material in Beltane's long history. The festival offers insights into pre-Christian European religion, the process of Christianization, the persistence of folk customs, the construction of modern paganism, and the universal human impulse toward ritual and celebration. Three broader patterns emerge from Beltane's legacy. First, traditions are remarkably resilient when they serve genuine human needs and speak to deep cultural patterns. Surface forms may change dramatically, but underlying structures can persist for thousands of years. Beltane has survived because it addresses enduring human concerns about health, fertility, community, and humanity's relationship with natural cycles. Second, religious change is rarely total replacement, but usually involves complex processes of adaptation, syncretism, and preservation. Christianity didn't simply erase pagan traditions. It absorbed, modified, and coexisted with them in various ways. Understanding this complexity helps us better understand both historical processes and how culture changes generally. Third, the past remains alive in the present in ways both obvious and subtle. When modern people dance around maypoles, gather flowers in May, or light bonfires to celebrate spring, they're participating in patterns that reach back thousands of years. The specific meanings attached to these actions may differ dramatically from ancient times, but the actions themselves maintain continuity. We are never as disconnected from the past as we might think. Beltane ultimately reminds us that we are seasonal creatures living on a seasonal planet. Modern technology and urban life can insulate us from direct experience of nature's cycles. We can eat strawberries in January, maintain constant temperature indoors year-round, and light our homes regardless of the sun's position. But underneath this technological buffering, our bodies and psyches still respond to seasonal change. We still need ways to mark time's passage, celebrate renewal, and acknowledge our participation in patterns larger than individual lives. The festival's long survival and modern revival suggest that the impulses it expresses will continue finding new forms of expression as long as humans exist. We will always need to celebrate spring's return. We will always value community and ritual. We will always seek ways to feel connected to something beyond our individual selves, whether we call that something gods, nature, tradition, or simply the turning of the seasons. Beltane's journey from ancient Celtic fire festival through Christian adaptation to modern neo-pagan revival demonstrates the extraordinary continuity of cultural patterns across time. The specific forms change, the explicit meanings transform, but the essential human responses to seasonal change, to community needs, and to the sacred dimensions of existence persist. That persistence is Beltane's greatest legacy, and perhaps its most important lesson for understanding human culture and spirituality.